In the summer of 1914, Europe stood at what its inhabitants believed was the apex of human achievement. Electric lights illuminated the boulevards of Paris. Steam trains connected Berlin to Vienna in hours. The British Empire commanded a quarter of the globe. Universities churned out engineers, doctors, lawyers. Cathedrals still filled on Sundays. Men wore suits to factory work. Children learned Latin. The word progress was spoken like a prayer. This was the world that produced Lieutenant Charles Sorley, a 20-year-old English poet educated at Marlborough College, fluent in German, who spent the months before the war hiking through the Moselle Valley, writing verse about friendship and the beauty of rain-soaked hillsides. This was the world that produced Henri Barbusse, a French novelist of 31 who had never fired a rifle, who volunteered for service despite his age and poor health because he believed in the Republic and the rights of man. This was the world that produced Ernst Jünger, an 18-year-old German student from Heidelberg who had run away to join the French Foreign Legion a year earlier, seeking adventure, who returned home to enlist the moment war was declared because duty called and the fatherland needed her sons. These men were not barbarians. They were the inheritors of Kant and Voltaire, of Goethe and Shakespeare, of Newton and Darwin. They had been raised on notions of honor, courage, duty, sacrifice. They believed in law. They believed in God, or at least in the moral architecture God had left behind. They believed war would be like the paintings they had seen in museums, cavalry charges at sunset, brave stands on hillsides, noble death for a noble cause, a quick affair, honorable combat, home by Christmas. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II told his troops they would return before the leaves fall. British recruitment posters showed clean-jawed men in pressed uniforms standing beside their proud mothers. In Paris, crowds sang the Marseillaise in the streets and threw flowers at marching soldiers. In London, men queued for blocks to enlist, afraid the war would end before they could see action. In Munich, a young Austrian painter named Adolf Hitler wept with joy when war was declared, falling to his knees in the Odeonsplatz to thank God for allowing him to live in such times. This enthusiasm was not manufactured, it was genuine. It was the product of a century without major European war, of a generation that had grown fat on industrial prosperity, of young men who had been told since childhood that their nations were destined for greatness and that war was the crucible in which manhood was forged. They believed what their fathers told them. They believed what their teachers told them. They believed what their priests told them. Roland Leighton, a 20-year-old Englishman engaged to the writer Vera Brittain, wrote to her in August 1914, "I feel that I am meant to take an active part in this war. It is to me a very fascinating thing, something if often horrible, yet very ennobling and very beautiful, something whose elemental reality raises it above the reach of all cold theorizing. He would be dead within 16 months, shot through the stomach in no man's land, lying in the mud for hours calling for water before dying alone in the dark." Julian Grenfell, an aristocratic British officer and published poet, wrote in his diary in September 1914, "I adore war. It is like a big picnic without the objectlessness of a picnic. I have never been so well or so happy." He would die in May 1915 from shrapnel wounds to the head, blind and delirious, whispering lines from his own poetry as his brain bled. These were educated men, thinking men. They carried volumes of poetry in their packs. They wrote letters home describing the landscape, the weather, the camaraderie of the regiment. They believed in rules. They believed in honor. They believed that even in war, civilization would prevail, that because they were civilized men, the war would be a civilized affair. The German officer Walter Limmer wrote in his diary in August 1914, "We advance as if on parade, rifles slung over shoulders. The French lie before us in the grass and fire. They hit several of our men. Then we reach them. I cut off a bayonet thrust, then strike. He falls. I am intoxicated with excitement. We all are. We are no longer human beings, but wild beasts." He wrote this on the fourth day of the war. The French poet Charles Péguy, a devout Catholic who believed the war was a sacred duty to defend Christian civilization against German militarism, was shot in the forehead on September 5, 1914, during the First Battle of the Marne. He had been in combat for 5 days. His body was found in a beet field, still clutching his rosary. Before the war, European militaries were studied institutions. Officers were gentlemen. War colleges taught logistics, map reading, the theories of Clausewitz and Napoleon. Battles were simulated on tabletops with wooden blocks representing divisions. Victory was assumed to be a matter of proper planning, superior morale, and national character. The British believed their volunteer army of professionals would crush the conscripted amateurs of Germany. The Germans believed their mobilization schedules and railway timetables would deliver swift victory through superior organization. The French believed in the offensive spirit, in Elan, in the bayonet charge that would sweep away any defense through sheer will and courage. All of them were wrong. The industrialization that had brought streetlights and telephones and motorcars had also perfected the machine gun, the howitzer, the explosive shell. Chemical engineering had produced poison gas. Metallurgy had created steel helmets and barbed wire. Railroads could transport millions of men to the front faster than horses could pursue them from victory to victory. Factories could produce ammunition faster than battles could expend it. The telegraph allowed commanders to coordinate from hundreds of miles away, turning battles into grinding bureaucratic procedures rather than moments of glory. The war that was supposed to end by Christmas would last 4 years, 3 months, and 7 days. It would kill approximately 17 million people. It would wound 23 million more. It would destroy 4 empires. It would redraw the map of Europe. It would birth ideologies that would kill tens of millions more in the decades to come. But none of that was the true horror. The true horror was what it did to the men who fought it, what it revealed about them, what it turned them into. The horror was the regression. Trenches were not trenches in the way that word suggests. They were not neat ditches with wooden walls and organized firing positions. They were wounds carved into the earth, collapsing burrows that filled with water and shit and blood, serpentine nightmares that stretched for hundreds of miles from the Swiss border to the English Channel. In some places they were shallow scrapes barely deep enough to crouch in. In others they were elaborate underground cities with concrete bunkers and electric lights and telephone lines. But everywhere they were filthy. Everywhere they stank. Everywhere they killed. The smell is impossible to describe to someone who has never experienced it, but those who lived in the trenches tried. One British soldier described it as the smell of death mixed with chloride of lime and rotting sandbags and old stale gas and overflowing latrines and human sweat and unwashed bodies and boots that have been wet for weeks and the sweet sick smell of decomposition that hangs over everything like a fog. Another wrote simply, "It is the smell of evil." The rats came first. Always the rats. They bred in the corpses that lay unburied in no man's land, growing fat on human flesh until they were the size of house cats. They invaded the trenches at night, thousands of them, bold and vicious, chewing through kit bags to reach the rations inside, crawling over sleeping men, biting faces and fingers. Soldiers would wake to find rats on their chests, staring at them with black eyes that reflected the flare light like tiny stars. Some men learned to kill them with shovels or clubs, stacking the bodies in piles and setting them on fire, but more always came. The rats never stopped coming. Private Harry Patch of the British Army, interviewed decades later at age 111, still remembered the rats. "You would see them feeding on the dead," he said. "And you knew that if you were wounded and couldn't move, they would feed on you too." The lice came next, body lice, billions of them, infesting every uniform, every blanket, every piece of cloth. They lived in the seams of the fabric, laying eggs that survived washing and heat, emerging to bite and burrow and spread typhus. Men would strip naked in the reserve trenches and burn the lice out of their uniforms with candles, killing hundreds only to find hundreds more the next day. The itching never stopped. The biting never stopped. Men scratched themselves raw, scratched until they bled, and the lice drank the blood and multiplied. Then came trench foot. It began as numbness, a tingling in the toes after days of standing in cold water. The numbness became pain. The pain became agony. The skin turned white, then red, then black. The flesh began to rot. The smell was distinctive, sweet and nauseating. The smell of dead meat. Men would remove their boots and find their socks fused to their feet, the skin sloughing off in sheets, the bones visible underneath. In extreme cases, toes and entire feet would fall off without amputation, simply detaching from the leg like overripe fruit. Doctors amputated thousands of feet, tens of thousands. The pile of severed limbs outside the field, hospitals grew so large they had to be burned. But the physical decay was nothing compared to the artillery. The howitzers fired day and night, massive guns that hurled shells weighing hundreds of pounds across miles of distance to explode in the trenches with the force of earthquakes, high explosive shells, shrapnel shells that burst in the air and sent thousands of steel balls tearing through flesh and bone, gas shells that released chlorine or phosgene or mustard gas that burned the lungs and eyes and skin. The bombardments went on for hours, for days, for weeks. During the Battle of the Somme, the British fired 1.7 million shells in the week-long preliminary bombardment. The noise was so loud it could be heard in London, 140 miles away. Men went deaf, men went insane, men simply vanished, blown into fragments so small their bodies could never be identified. A British officer named Siegfried Sassoon, who would later become one of the war's most famous poets, described a bombardment in his diary. When the shells began to fall, the ground shook. The noise was beyond comprehension, a physical force that crushed thought and turned the world into pure sound. Men pressed themselves into the walls of the trench and clawed at the earth like animals. Some prayed, some screamed, some simply stared, their mouths open, their eyes empty. And through it all the shells kept coming, one after another, hour after hour, until time itself seemed to stop, and there was nothing in the universe except the explosions and the waiting for the next explosion. The waiting was worse than the shelling. During the bombardment, men could only endure, pressed into dugouts and corners, helpless, praying each shell would miss. But in the silence between bombardments came the waiting, the knowledge that it would start again, that it always started again. Men counted the seconds. They listened for the whistle of incoming shells, trying to judge by the sound whether it would land close or far. They flinched at every distant boom. They stopped sleeping. They stopped eating. They stopped feeling human. Lieutenant Ernst Jünger of the German army, who would survive the war and write one of its most famous memoirs, described the effect of prolonged shelling with clinical detachment. After a bombardment of several hours' duration, the men no longer resembled themselves. Their faces were grey and drawn, their eyes hollow and staring. They moved mechanically, without thought or will. Some trembled continuously, some laughed at nothing, some wept without making sound. The artillery had done what no amount of combat could do. It had broken their spirits before the battle even began. At Verdun, the French and Germans fought for 10 months over a few miles of ground. The battle began with a German bombardment that fired 2 million shells in 12 hours, the most intense artillery barrage in human history up to that point. The French defenders, many of whom had been in the trenches for weeks, simply disintegrated. Some went mad immediately, running out into the open to be cut down by machine guns rather than endure another moment of the shelling. Others became catatonic, unable to speak or move, staring at nothing while their companions screamed for them to take cover. One French soldier wrote in his diary, "The shells fall without end. The ground is so churned by explosions that nothing remains. No trees, no grass, no trenches, only shell holes, thousands of them, filled with water and corpses. We crouch in the mud between the holes and wait to die. That is all we do. We wait. We are not soldiers anymore. We are animals in a trap." Another wrote, "I have seen men buried alive by shells, their hands sticking up from the earth, moving feebly until they stop moving. I have seen men torn in half, their bodies scattered across the crater rim, still trying to crawl. I have seen men with their faces blown off, walking in circles, making sounds that are not human. I have seen these things, and I continue to function, and I do not know what that makes me." The Battle of the Somme began on July 1st, 1916, with another massive bombardment, this one lasting 7 days. The British believed they had destroyed the German defences, that their men would simply walk across no man's land and occupy the empty trenches. They were wrong. The German dugouts were 30 feet deep, reinforced with concrete and timber, impervious to all but direct hits from the heaviest shells. The German soldiers waited in the darkness while the British shells fell, and when the bombardment stopped and the British infantry began their advance, the Germans climbed up from their bunkers, set up their machine guns, and opened fire. 58,000 British casualties on the first day, 20,000 dead. Many of them fell in the first hour. They walked forward in neat lines, as they had been trained to do, laden with 60 pounds of equipment, and the machine guns cut them down in swathes like wheat before a scythe. The dead lay so thickly in some places that the follow-up waves had to climb over the bodies. Some of the wounded drowned in shell holes, too injured to climb out. Others lay in no man's land for days, calling for water, calling for their mothers, until they died or went silent. One German machine gunner, quoted later, said, "We did not believe men could be so brave or so foolish. They kept coming. We kept firing. They kept falling. After a while it was like a machine, like a factory. Load, aim, fire, load, aim, fire. The bodies piled up like cordwood, and still they came." At Passchendaele in 1917, the British attacked through mud so deep that wounded men drowned in it. The preliminary bombardment had destroyed the drainage systems that had kept the Flanders lowlands dry for centuries, and the autumn rains turned the battlefield into a swamp. Men advanced through mud that reached their waists, moving at a crawl, fully exposed to enemy fire. Tanks sank and disappeared. Artillery pieces sank and disappeared. Men sank and disappeared. The mud was thick and sticky with the consistency of wet cement, and it pulled men down as they struggled. Those who fell face first suffocated. Those who fell on their backs drowned. Their companions tried to pull them out, but the mud was stronger. Hundreds of men simply vanished into the mud at Passchendaele. They were recorded as missing, but their bodies were never found because their bodies ceased to exist as discrete objects. They became part of the landscape. The mud absorbed them. A British chaplain wrote, "I have seen the face of God, and it is mud. Mud that covers everything, mud that destroys everything, mud that transforms men into writhing demons who shriek and claw and beg for death. Mud that is made of earth and water and the liquefied remains of 10,000 corpses. Mud that we walk through and fight in and eat and breathe. Mud that will be here long after we are gone, containing within it all the horror we have inflicted and all the horror we have endured. But the mud and the shells and the rats and the lice were not the worst of it. The worst of it was what it did to the mind. Sleep deprivation broke men faster than anything else. In the frontline trenches, men stayed awake for days at a time, unable to sleep because of the noise, the fear, the stand to orders at dawn and dusk when attacks were most likely. They became zombies, stumbling through their duties with dead eyes, making mistakes, seeing things that were not there. Some fell asleep standing up. Some fell asleep on sentry duty and were shot by their own officers for cowardice. Some simply collapsed and could not be woken. Charles Carrington, a British officer who later became a historian of the war, wrote in his memoir, "Continuous fear produces a specific type of exhaustion that is unlike any other. It is not physical tiredness, though that is present. It is a spiritual exhaustion, a draining of the will to live. After weeks in the front line, men ceased to care whether they lived or died. They ceased to care about anything. They functioned, but they did not feel. They spoke, but they did not think. They existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the bullet or shell that would end it." Shell shock was the term the doctors used, but it was inadequate. The symptoms varied wildly. Some men trembled uncontrollably. Some could not speak. Some went blind or deaf with no physical injury. Some became violent, attacking their comrades or themselves. Some regressed to childlike states, crying for their mothers, wetting themselves, unable to feed themselves. Some simply stared at nothing, catatonic, unreachable, trapped inside their own skulls with whatever horrors they had witnessed. The British Army shot soldiers for cowardice, hundreds of them, young men who could not make themselves go over the top one more time, who had reached the absolute limit of human endurance and broken. They were given perfunctory courts-martial and executed by firing squad at dawn, their comrades forced to watch as a warning. The French army did the same. The Germans did the same. All the armies did the same. One British private, executed for desertion in 1916, had enlisted in 1914 at age 17, lying about his age. He had fought at Ypres, at Luce, on the Somme. He had been buried alive by a shell and dug out. He had seen his best friend's head blown off. He had spent 26 consecutive months in the trenches with only brief rest periods. When he walked away from the line in October 1916, he made it 4 miles before he was caught. At his court-martial, he could not speak. He was executed the next morning, tied to a post, a paper target pinned to his chest over. During the mutinies, the war might have ended differently, but both sides were equally broken. The German soldiers called their experience Die Materialsschlacht, the battle of materials. They were not warriors. They were raw material, fed into a machine that ground them up and spat them out. The individual soldier meant nothing. The industrial process meant everything. And in that industrial process, something began to change in the men who survived. After months of shelling and gas and mud and lice and death, after watching their friends blown apart, after living with the rats and the smell of corpses and the knowledge that today might be the day, after all of that, the civilization fell away, the mask cracked, the beast began to wake. The raids began in 1915, quietly, without fanfare or official sanction. Small groups of men, volunteers mostly, slipping out of the trenches after dark to cross no man's land and enter the enemy lines. Their objectives varied: capture prisoners for interrogation, destroy machine gun nests, gather intelligence, spread terror. But the real purpose was simpler and darker. The raids existed because men needed them. Because after months of passive suffering under artillery fire, of waiting helplessly to die, some men needed to kill actively, needed to take control, needed to feel powerful again. The Germans called them Stoßtruppen, shock troops. The British called them trench raiders. The French called them nettoyeurs de tranchées, trench cleaners. All of them meant the same thing: men who had learned to kill at close quarters, in darkness and silence, with cold efficiency and hot blood. They left their rifles behind. This was not a matter of tactics alone. Though rifles were cumbersome in narrow trenches and gunfire would alert the enemy, it was deeper than that. The rifle represented distance, civilization, the industrial method of killing. You aimed at a target, you pulled a trigger, the target fell. There was separation between killer and killed, a mechanical intermediary, a layer of abstraction. The rifle allowed you to remain human while doing inhuman things, and the club did not allow that. The trench raiders carried brutal, improvised weapons, spiked clubs made from baseball bats studded with nails, trench knives with brass knuckle handles, and 7-inch blades designed for stabbing and slashing, sharpened entrenching tools that could split a skull with one swing, weighted socks filled with stones or metal bolts, homemade blackjacks, straight razors. In some units, men filed their teeth into points like animals. In others, they painted their faces with mud or charcoal. They were creating an identity, transforming themselves from soldiers into something else, something prehistoric, something that existed before law and morality and civilization. Lieutenant William Watson of the British Army described his first raid in his diary with unsettling clarity. We went over at 2 a.m., 12 men, all volunteers. The night was moonless. We crawled on our bellies across no man's land, through the wire we had cut earlier, into the German trench. It was empty except for one sentry. Private Morrison came up behind him and crushed his skull with a club before the German could make a sound. The man fell without a cry. We stood there in the darkness, breathing hard, and then Morrison looked at his club, looked at the blood and brain matter on it, and smiled. That smile terrified me more than anything I had seen in this war. Ernst Jünger described raid tactics with his characteristic analytical detachment in Storm of Steel. The raid is the purest form of combat. No artillery support, no grand strategy, only small groups of men moving through darkness to engage in close combat with the enemy. The raider must be physically strong, mentally alert, and morally hardened. He must be capable of entering an enemy trench and killing every man inside without hesitation, without mercy, without thought. The successful raider is not a man who has overcome his fear. He is a man who has transcended it entirely, who has moved beyond the normal human emotional responses to violence and death. The British developed specialist training schools for raiders. Men were taught hand-to-hand combat, silent movement, throat-cutting techniques. They practiced on dummy trenches, learned to move without sound, to kill without warning. The training emphasized aggression, speed, ruthlessness. Instructors told them, show no mercy, take no chances, kill anything that moves. The enemy would do the same. But many raiders did not need to be taught. The violence came naturally, emerging from something deep inside that the war had awakened. Sergeant Robert Graves, who would later become a famous poet and novelist, described a raiding party in his memoir, Goodbye to All That. The men selected for raids were not the best soldiers in the conventional sense. They were the wildest, the most aggressive, the ones who had trouble with discipline in normal circumstances. Men with criminal backgrounds, brawlers, the ones who seemed to enjoy violence for its own sake. These were the men who thrived in the raids, who volunteered again and again, who came back with blood on their hands and light in their eyes. The Germans had their own specialists. The Stoßtruppen were elite units, carefully selected and trained, equipped with special weapons and armor. They developed tactics that would become the foundation of modern infantry warfare: infiltration, bypassing strong points, exploiting weaknesses, moving fast, and hitting hard. But beneath the tactical sophistication was the same brutal reality. They were teaching men to kill up close, to enjoy killing, to become efficient killers. A German Stoßtruppen officer named Ernst Jünger wrote in a letter to his brother in 1916, "We train them to think like predators. The raid is a hunt, and the enemy are prey. We teach them to move in darkness, to use terrain, to coordinate without speaking. But most importantly, we teach them to shed their civilized inhibitions. A man who hesitates in a trench fight is a dead man. A man who feels guilt or remorse is useless to us. We need men who can drive a bayonet into an enemy's throat without thinking, who can brain a sentry with a shovel without flinching. And once we have created such men, we cannot undo the work. They are changed forever." The raids followed a pattern. A small group, usually 10 to 20 men, would slip out of their trenches after dark, crawling through the mud and wire of no man's land. They moved slowly, silently, sometimes taking hours to cross a few hundred yards. They listened for German patrols, for sentries, for any sound that might reveal enemy positions. When they reached the German wire, they cut through it with specially designed cutters, creating gaps just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Then they entered the enemy trench. What happened next depended on what they found. If the trench was empty, they would plant explosives or destroy equipment and retreat. But if the trench was occupied, they killed. A British officer named C.E. Montague, who wrote a famous memoir called Disenchantment, described the killing in explicit detail. The first man died silently, his throat cut from behind before he could turn. The second died fighting, struck repeatedly with a club until his skull shattered and he fell. The third tried to surrender, raising his hands, crying "Kamerad," but was stabbed in the chest and pushed aside. The fourth ran, made it 5 yards down the trench before a shovel blade caught him in the back of the neck, nearly severing his head. 5 men dead in less than a minute. Our raiders moved through the trench like wolves through a sheepfold, killing everything that moved. The killers did not always return unchanged. Some came back silent, unable or unwilling to speak about what they had done. Some came back laughing, high on adrenaline, still filled with the thrill of violence. Some came back different in ways that were harder to define, harder, colder, more distant from their fellow soldiers. But some came back wanting more. Private Henry Williamson, who would later write the novel A Fox Under My Cloak, volunteered for 7 raids. He described his motivation in an interview decades later. "I was terrified before every raid, but once we were in the German trench, once the killing started, the fear vanished. It was replaced by something else, a clarity, a sense of absolute presence. Time slowed down. Everything became sharp and bright and clear. I felt more alive in those moments than at any other time in my life. And when it was over, when we were back in our own trench, I felt empty, dead inside. And I wanted to feel alive again, so I volunteered again." This was the thing no one wanted to acknowledge. Some men became addicted to the violence. Not all, perhaps not even many, but some. They sought out raids, volunteered for dangerous patrols, put themselves in situations where they would have to kill at close quarters. They were not psychopaths in the clinical sense. Many of them had been normal men before the war, with families and jobs and ordinary lives. But the war had revealed something inside them, or created something inside them, and once awakened, it could not be put back to sleep. Ernst Jünger was perhaps the most famous and most disturbing example. A German officer and writer, Jünger was wounded 14 times during the war, but kept returning to the front. He wrote about combat with an aesthetic appreciation that bordered on the erotic, describing battles as beautiful, describing killing as a transcendent experience. In Storm of Steel, published in 1920, he wrote, "The best thing about war is killing. There is no equivalent experience in civilian life. The man who has never killed has never truly lived. In the moment of killing, all pretense falls away. You see yourself clearly for the first time. You understand what you are capable of. You become fully human by becoming fully animal." His contemporaries found his honesty disturbing. Henri Barbusse, the French novelist who wrote Under Fire, responded to Junger's philosophy with horror. "Men like Jünger frighten me more than the war itself. The war made them into monsters and they embraced it. They did not resist the transformation. They welcomed it. They glorified it. They want to remake society in the image of the trenches, where life is cheap and violence is the only currency that matters." The raids revealed something that the generals and politicians did not want to admit. Modern warfare, despite all its technology and logistics, ultimately came down to men killing other men at close range, in darkness and filth, with primitive weapons. The rifles and machine guns and artillery were killing machines, impersonal and efficient, but the raids required personal killing, intimate killing, killing where you could see the enemy's face and smell his fear and feel his blood on your hands. And some men were very good at it. The French developed special units called Corps Francs, free companies. These were men who operated with minimal supervision, given broad latitude to conduct raids however they saw fit. They were authorized to take any action they deemed necessary, including executing prisoners, mutilating corpses, and terrorizing enemy positions. The goal was to spread fear, to make the Germans afraid to man their trenches at night, to break their morale through calculated brutality. One such unit was led by a captain named Arnaud, a former colonial officer who had fought in Algeria and Morocco. His men were known for their ferocity. They killed German sentries and left the bodies displayed in obscene positions as warnings. They raided German dugouts and left no survivors. Prisoners were rare. German soldiers began to call them Die Teufel, the devils. Arnaud wrote in his journal, recovered after his death in 1918, "We are not soldiers. We are predators. The enemy must fear us more than they fear death itself. When a German sentry sees movement in no man's land at night, he should pray it is an artillery barrage and not us. We give no quarter. We take no prisoners. We are what the war has made us, and we are very good at what we do." But it was not just the elite units. It was not just the specialists. The regression spread. In 1916, a British private named Albert Rochester wrote a letter to his sister that was intercepted by the military censors and never delivered. In it, he described what had happened to him. "I have killed men with my bare hands. I have beaten them to death with rocks. I have strangled them in the darkness of a shell hole while they struggled and choked and clawed at my face. I have done these things, and I do not feel what I should feel. I do not feel horror or guilt or remorse. I feel nothing. It is as if the part of me that would feel those things has been cut away, removed like a tumor. I look at my hands, and they are the hands of a stranger. I look in a mirror, and I do not recognize the man looking back. Something has been taken from me, or perhaps something has been revealed. I do not know which is worse." This was the regression, not a descent into chaos, but a descent into clarity. The civilized veneer had been stripped away by the industrial horror of modern warfare, revealing the animal beneath, and that animal was capable of things the civilized man could never contemplate. The trenches became laboratories for this transformation. Men who had never hit another person before the war became efficient killers. Men who had gone to church on Sundays learned to slit throats without hesitation. Men who had worked as clerks and farmers and teachers discovered they were capable of extraordinary violence, and some of them discovered they were good at it, and some of them discovered they liked it. A German soldier named Gustav Meyer, captured by the British in 1917, told his interrogators, You cannot understand what it is like unless you have been there. After a year in the trenches, you are not the same man. You have seen too much, done too much. The old life seems like a dream. The old self seems like a story you were told about someone else. You become hard. You become cold. You become capable of things you never imagined, and you stop questioning it. You stop thinking about it. You just do what needs to be done, and you feel nothing. This was what the war had discovered. Civilization was thin, thinner than anyone had believed. A few months of industrial slaughter, of constant fear and degradation and death, and the civilized European man reverted to something older, something that had been hiding beneath the suits and education and religious doctrine all along. The beast had always been there. The war just gave it permission to wake up. As the war ground on, as the body count climbed into the millions and Europe transformed into a charnel house, men tried to make sense of it. They tried to find meaning in the slaughter, purpose in the suffering, some philosophical framework that could contain the horror they were witnessing and perpetrating. What emerged was a fractured intellectual landscape, competing interpretations of the same catastrophe, each man constructing his own explanation for what the war meant and what it had revealed about human nature. For Ernst Jünger, the war was a revelation, a lifting of the veil, a stripping away of bourgeois illusions to reveal authentic existence. He embraced the violence not as a necessary evil, but as a positive good, arguing that combat represented the highest form of human experience. In Storm of Steel, he wrote with chilling honesty, "We are not fighting for ideals. We are fighting because fighting is what we are designed to do. The warrior is the natural state of man. Civilization is the aberration. The war has simply reminded us of this truth." Jünger drew explicitly on Nietzschean philosophy, particularly the concepts of the will to power and the Übermensch. He argued that the trenches had created a new type of man, one who had moved beyond Christian morality and bourgeois sentimentality. This new man, the soldier of the future, was hard, cold, efficient, untroubled by conscience or compassion. He had stared into the abyss and laughed. In his 1922 essay Der Kampf als inneres Erlebnis, Combat as Inner Experience, Jünger developed this philosophy further. The battlefield is the only place where man truly understands himself. In civilian life, we are actors playing roles, wearing masks, pretending to be something we are not. But in combat, the masks fall away. We see ourselves clearly. We discover what we are capable of, what we are willing to do to survive, and in that discovery we become free, free from the constraints of civilization, free from the judgments of others, free to express our true nature without apology or restraint. This was deeply disturbing philosophy. It celebrated the regression. It argued that the beast was not a failure of civilization but the truth beneath civilization, that the violence was not a tragedy but a cleansing, that the war had not destroyed European man but had perfected him. Many of Jünger's contemporaries recoiled in horror. Siegfried Sassoon, the British officer and poet who had won the Military Cross for bravery, called Jünger's philosophy the worship of death dressed up as philosophy. He confuses the adrenaline rush of combat with spiritual enlightenment. He mistakes brutality for authenticity. He has been so damaged by the war that he has forgotten what it means to be human. Sassoon himself had undergone a dramatic transformation. He had enlisted enthusiastically in 1914, fought bravely, led men with distinction, but by 1917 he had become one of the war's most eloquent critics. His protest statement, read aloud in the House of Commons, declared, "I believe that this war, upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation, has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I believe that the purposes for which I and my fellow soldiers entered this war should have been so clearly stated as to have made it impossible to change them. I have seen and endured the suffering of the troops, and I can no longer be a party to prolong these sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust. Sassoon was spared a court-martial only because his friend Robert Graves convinced the authorities that Sassoon was suffering from shell shock and needed medical treatment rather than punishment. Sassoon was sent to Craiglockhart War Hospital in Scotland, where he met another poet-soldier who would help define the war's literary legacy, Wilfred Owen. Owen was 24 years old, a sensitive young man who had enlisted in 1915 with romantic notions of heroism and glory. The trenches had destroyed those notions. His poetry, written in the final year of his life, expressed a visceral horror at what the war had become and what it had done to the men who fought it. In Dulce et decorum est, he described a gas attack with brutal clarity. "Gas! Gas! Quick, boys!" An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime, dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. The poem concluded with a savage rejection of the old patriotic lies. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest, to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. Owen declared that lie dead, killed by the truth of what modern war actually was. But Owen's objection was not to violence itself. He was a capable officer who killed Germans without hesitation, but to the meaninglessness of the violence, the gap between the reality of combat and the propaganda that justified it. In a letter to his mother in 1918 he wrote, "I came out in order to help these boys, directly by leading them as well as an officer can, indirectly by watching their sufferings that I may speak of them as well as a pleader can. I have done the first, I have not done the last." Owen was killed in action on November 4th, 1918, exactly 1 week before the armistice. He was leading his men across a canal when German machine guns opened fire. He was 25 years old. The French novelist Henri Barbusse offered yet another interpretation. His novel Le Feu, Under Fire, published in 1916 while the war was still raging, was a savage indictment of military leadership, nationalism, and the class system that had sent working men to die for causes they barely understood. Barbusse, a socialist, saw the war as a capitalist crime, a slaughter of the poor for the benefit of the rich. His protagonist, a common soldier, reflects, "Two armies are engaged in slaughter. Those that hurl themselves to the assault are not the ones that wanted war. Those that wanted war are safe behind the lines, in chalets and headquarters, smoking cigars and planning strategy. We are the ones who die. We are the ones who suffer. And when the war ends, if we survive, we will go back to our factories and our farms, and the rich will still be rich and the poor will still be poor, and it will be as if nothing had changed, except that millions of us will be dead, and the survivors will be broken, and Europe will be a graveyard." Barbusse's vision was fundamentally different from Jünger's. Where Jünger saw the war as revelation, Barbusse saw it as exploitation. Where Jünger celebrated the warrior, Barbusse mourned the victim. Where Jünger found meaning in combat, Barbusse found only senseless waste. Yet both men agreed on one crucial point: the war had destroyed the old world. The Europe of 1914, with its certainties and hierarchies and illusions, was gone forever. What would replace it remained unclear. The German writer Erich Maria Remarque, who served on the Western Front and was wounded 5 times, would later capture this sense of dislocation in his 1929 novel All Quiet on the Western Front. His protagonist, Paul Bäumer, reflects, "We are not youth any longer. We don't want to take the world by storm. We are fleeing. We fly from ourselves, from our life. We were 18 and had begun to love life and the world, and we had to shoot it to pieces. The first bomb, the first explosion burst in our hearts. We are cut off from activity, from striving, from progress. We believe in such things no longer. We believe in the war." This was the existential crisis at the heart of the war experience. Men had been taught that life had meaning, that actions had consequences, that moral choices mattered. The trenches taught them otherwise. Life was random, death was arbitrary, morality was irrelevant. The good died as easily as the wicked. Courage and cowardice were indistinguishable under artillery fire. Everything they had been told about how the world worked was a lie. Some men found this liberating. Jünger and those who thought like him embraced the chaos, the meaninglessness, the violence. They argued that the war had freed them from the burden of civilization, from the weight of moral responsibility. They could kill without guilt, because guilt was a social construct, a tool of control, a relic of a dead world. Other men found it horrifying. They had needed meaning, they had needed purpose. Without it, they were lost. And some men tried to create new meaning from the wreckage. The war had destroyed the old gods, Christianity, nationalism, progress, enlightenment. But perhaps new gods could be forged in the fires of combat, new ideologies, new systems, new orders. The fascist movements that would sweep Europe in the 1920s and 1930s were born in the trenches. Men like Mussolini, like Hitler, like countless lesser-known veterans who returned home unable to adjust to peace, who missed the clarity and intensity of combat, who wanted to recreate the warrior community of the front in civilian society. They had tasted power in the trenches, the power of life and death, the power of violence, the power of total commitment to a cause. They wanted that power again. Hitler, who served as a corporal in the German army and was wounded twice, wrote in Mein Kampf, "For me, as for every German, the most memorable period of my life now began. In comparison with the events of the gigantic struggle, all the past fell back into shallow nothingness. With proud sadness I think back on those days, and I'm moved by the memory of the comrades who were torn from my side forever and who gave their lives for the fatherland." He was lying or deluding himself. The war was not noble or glorious, but the myth of the war, the fantasy of comradeship, sacrifice, and meaningful violence was seductive. And it was this myth, this fantasy, that fascism would exploit. The Italian futurist F.T. Marinetti, who served as a volunteer in the Italian army, declared, "War is the world's only hygiene. War is beautiful because it establishes man's dominion over the subjugated machinery by means of gas masks, terrifying megaphones, flamethrowers, and small tanks. War is beautiful because it initiates the dreamt-of metallization of the human body." This was the death drive made manifest, the celebration not just of violence but of dehumanization, of the transformation of men into machines, of flesh into steel. Marinetti and the futurists wanted to accelerate the regression, to push it further, to create a new species of man who was part human, part machine, entirely inhuman. But, alongside these voices celebrating violence and death, other voices spoke of trauma, loss, and the impossibility of return. The German poet Georg Trakl, who served as a medical officer, committed suicide in 1914 after witnessing a battlefield strewn with mutilated bodies. His final poems spoke of a world drowning in blood, of God's absence, of the soul's annihilation. The British poet Isaac Rosenberg, killed in April 1918, wrote in Dead Man's Dump, "The wheels lurched over sprawled dead, but pained them not, though their bones crunched, their shut mouths made no moan. They lie there huddled, friend and foeman, man born of man and born of woman, and shells go crying over them from night till night and now." These men saw clearly what the war was, not revelation, not cleansing, not necessary violence, but catastrophe, pure catastrophe, the destruction of a generation, the betrayal of every ideal Europe had claimed to hold. The revelation that civilization was a fraud, progress was a lie, and humanity was capable of creating hells that exceeded any religious imagination. And beneath all these competing philosophies, beneath the attempts to find meaning or reject meaning, was a simpler truth. The act of killing had changed the killers, not in some abstract philosophical sense, but concretely, physiologically, psychologically. Men who had killed at close quarters, who had felt another man's blood on their hands, who had looked into dying eyes and felt nothing, these men were different afterward. Something inside them had shifted, some barrier had fallen, some inhibition had dissolved. Neurologists after the war would study these men, trying to understand what had happened to them. They found alterations in brain chemistry, damage to emotional regulation centers, permanent changes to the autonomic nervous system. The medical term was traumatic neurosis, but that captured only part of it. These men had not just been traumatized by violence, they had been transformed by it. The capacity for empathy had been burned away, replaced by a cold capacity for harm. The armistice was signed at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918. In some sectors, the shooting continued until the final moment, officers ordering one last attack, artillerymen firing one last barrage, men dying minutes before peace. Then silence. After 4 years of continuous noise, the thunder of artillery, the chatter of machine guns, the screams of the wounded, the Western Front fell silent. The survivors did not celebrate. They stood in their trenches, exhausted beyond measure, and waited to be told what to do next. What came next was the return home. Millions of men, discharged from service, sent back to the countries and cities and villages they had left behind. They came back in their dirty uniforms, many still wearing their helmets, carrying their kit bags and their rifles, and the invisible weight of what they had seen and done. They came home to a world that had not changed, the same streets, the same houses, the same people, older now, marked by their own suffering, but fundamentally the same. The war had destroyed Europe's young men while leaving Europe's physical infrastructure largely intact. The cities were still standing, the factories were still running, life had continued. This was, for many veterans, incomprehensible. How could the world be unchanged when they themselves were so profoundly altered? How could people go about their daily business, shopping, working, laughing, when millions had died in ways so horrible that the mind could barely contain them? The gap between the veterans' experience and the civilians' experience was unbridgeable. Robert Graves, returning to Oxford University after the war, wrote, "I could not adjust. Everything seemed trivial. Students arguing about philosophy and literature, I wanted to scream at them, to tell them nothing mattered, that I had seen what the world really was, that their debates and discussions were meaningless games. But I said nothing. I smiled and nodded and pretended to care. Inside, I was dead." Siegfried Sassoon, back in England, described his alienation in brutally honest terms. "I would sit at dinner parties and listen to people talk about politics, about the arts, about scandals and gossip, and I would feel nothing, no connection, no interest. I had spent years in close quarters with men who were about to die, who knew they were about to die, and who faced that knowledge with courage or fear or resignation. These people had faced nothing, they had suffered nothing. They were children, and I hated them for it." The French called it l'esprit du front, the spirit of the front. Veterans shared an experience so profound, so transformative, that it separated them permanently from those who had not served. They could speak to each other, these veterans, in ways they could not speak to anyone else. A look, a nod, an unspoken understanding. They had been to a place the civilians could never go, had seen things the civilians could never imagine, and that knowledge isolated them like a moat. Ernst Jünger, ever the analyst, wrote, "The civilian looks at the veteran and sees a hero. The veteran looks at the civilian and sees a child. The civilian thinks the war was glorious. The veteran knows it was necessary. The gap between these two perceptions is absolute and permanent. The veteran can never explain what he experienced. The civilian can never understand. This is the tragedy of modern war. It creates a class of men who can no longer relate to their own society." Many veterans simply could not function in peacetime. They found civilian life impossibly boring, impossibly safe, impossibly meaningless. They missed the trenches. They missed the clarity of combat, where every decision mattered, where life was reduced to its essentials: survive, protect your comrades, kill the enemy. Civilian life offered no such clarity. It offered only ambiguity, complexity, mundane problems with no clear solutions. A British veteran named Stephen Graham, writing in 1920, described this phenomenon. Many men who had been excellent soldiers were complete failures as civilians. They could not hold jobs. They could not maintain relationships. They wandered from place to place, unable to settle, always searching for something they could not name. They were addicted to danger, to adrenaline, to the intensity of life at the front. Peace left them feeling empty, hollowed out, purposeless. Some veterans turned to violence. Not all, but a significant number. They joined paramilitary groups, mercenary outfits, revolutionary movements. Germany saw the rise of the Freikorps, volunteer militias of ex-soldiers who fought communists, put down uprisings, killed with the same efficiency they had learned in the trenches. Italy saw the Arditi, elite assault troops who became the shock troops of fascism. Throughout Europe, veterans formed the core of extremist movements, bringing military discipline and a capacity for violence to political struggles. Others turned inward, they drank, they used drugs, morphine, heroin, cocaine, whatever they could find to numb the memories. British doctors prescribed massive amounts of opiates to shell-shock victims. Many became addicted, many died of overdoses. The exact numbers are unknown because addiction and suicide were not officially tracked, but estimates suggest tens of thousands of veterans died this way in the decade after the war. Suicide rates among veterans were extraordinarily high. Men who had survived 4 years of combat, who had endured unimaginable horror, came home and shot themselves in quiet rooms with their service revolvers. The official records list these as accidents or natural deaths, but everyone knew the truth. A French veteran named Paul Cazin, who survived the war only to kill himself in 1920, left a note that was published anonymously. "I have tried to live in this world, but I cannot. I am a ghost. Everything I see, everything I touch, feels unreal. Only the war was real, only the trenches were true. I close my eyes and I am back there in the mud, in the noise, in the blood, and I realize that is where I belong, that is where I died. My body came home, but my soul stayed in France, buried in the mud with my comrades. I am already dead. This is just the formality of catching up." The inability to feel became a defining characteristic of many veterans. They described themselves as numb, empty, incapable of normal emotional responses. They could not cry. They could not laugh with genuine joy. They could not love with full hearts. The war had burned away something essential, left them emotionally cauterized, capable only of muted approximations of human feeling. A German veteran interviewed in 1929 put it simply, "I look at my wife and children and I know I should feel something. I know I love them in some abstract sense, but I cannot feel it. The capacity for that kind of feeling was destroyed in 1916 in a trench near Verdun when I killed a French soldier with my bare hands. Something broke inside me that day, and it has never healed. I function, I work, I provide, but I am not truly alive." The nightmares were universal. Every veteran had them. Nightmares of drowning in mud, of being buried alive, of watching their friends die over and over. They would wake screaming, thrashing, sometimes attacking their wives in the confusion between dream and reality. Some veterans refused to sleep in beds, instead sleeping on floors or in closets, unable to tolerate the vulnerability of being comfortable. One British veteran described his nightmares in a letter to a psychiatrist. "Every night I am back in the trench. The barrage is falling. My men are dying. I try to help them, but I have no arms. I try to speak, but I have no voice. I can only watch as they are torn apart, as they call for me, as they die alone. And then I am the one dying. I feel the bullet enter my chest. I feel my lungs filling with blood. I try to breathe and cannot. I drown in my own blood, slowly, knowing there is no help coming, knowing this is how I will die. And then I wake up, and for a moment I do not know if I am alive or dead, and I am not sure which would be preferable." The obsession with order, with control, with routine became another common trait. Veterans could not tolerate chaos or unpredictability. They needed structure, needed rules, needed everything in its place. Their homes became like military barracks, every object positioned precisely, every task performed on schedule. This was a desperate attempt to impose the discipline of the trenches on civilian life, to create an environment where they felt safe. But safety was impossible. The war had taught them that death was random, that control was an illusion, that at any moment everything could be destroyed. This knowledge was corrosive. It made happiness impossible, because happiness required vulnerability, required the ability to let go, required trust in the future, and veterans could not trust the future. They had learned too well that the future held only death. The relationships destroyed by the war were incalculable. Men returned to wives they no longer loved, to children they could not connect with, to families that seemed alien and distant. Divorce rates spiked, domestic violence increased. Many veterans simply abandoned their families, unable to bear the performance of normalcy, walking away to live as vagrants or hermits. A French veteran named André Nebly, who deserted his family in 1922, was found dead in the forest in 1927. His body had been there for days. In his pocket was a letter addressed to no one. I tried to be the man I was before. I tried to be a husband, a father, a citizen. But that man is dead. He died at Verdun. I am someone else now, something else, and that something cannot live in the world of houses and jobs and everyday kindness. I belong to the mud. I belong to the dead. I am going to join them now. Perhaps there I will find peace. The political consequences of this mass psychological damage were profound. Millions of men returned from the war disillusioned with democracy, with liberalism, with the entire political system that had sent them to die. They had been promised glory and had found only horror. They had been told the war was necessary and had learned it was pointless. They had been assured their sacrifice mattered and had discovered it meant nothing. This disillusionment created fertile ground for extremism. Fascism promised order, discipline, purpose, the very things veterans had found in the trenches and lost in peacetime. It promised to restore meaning through violence, to create a society organized along military lines, to give veterans the recognition and power they felt they deserved. Adolf Hitler understood this psychology intimately. He was one of these men, a veteran who could not adjust to peace, who spent the 1920s searching for purpose and finding it in politics. His appeal to veterans was direct. He told them their suffering had not been in vain, that they had been betrayed by weak civilian leaders, that Germany's defeat was not military but political. He promised revenge. He promised a restoration of martial values. He promised a future that looked like the trenches, clear enemies, absolute loyalty, victory or death. And millions of veterans believed him. They joined the Nazi Party. They joined the SA, the paramilitary wing. They used the skills they had learned in the trenches, violence, intimidation, ruthless efficiency, to destroy Germany's democratic institutions and install a dictatorship. This was the ultimate consequence of the regression. Men who had been broken by war, who had lost their connection to civilized values, who had become efficient killers, now turned their skills on their own societies. The violence that had been contained in the trenches, directed at external enemies, now erupted into Europe itself. Mussolini in Italy, Franco in Spain, countless smaller movements in France, Britain, Hungary, Romania, all of them led by veterans, all of them promising a return to masculine strength, national glory, the purifying violence of total commitment. One Italian veteran, explaining why he joined the fascists, said simply, "In the war, I knew who I was. I knew my purpose. I knew my enemy. In peacetime, everything is confused. Everything is ambiguous. Everyone is weak. The fascists offer clarity. They offer strength. They offer a return to the values of the trenches, where men were men and life had meaning. I would rather die fighting for something than live for nothing." This was the tragedy. The war had not ended in 1918. It had simply moved. The trenches had closed, but the mentality of the trenches persisted. The violence had stopped, but the capacity for violence remained. The beast had been awakened, and it could not be put back to sleep. The writer Robert Musil, an Austrian veteran and novelist, captured this in his essay, The German as Symptom. The war taught us that civilization is fragile, that beneath the surface of law and custom and moral teaching lies a capacity for savagery that can be activated with surprising ease. We believed we were evolved beyond barbarism. The war proved we were wrong, and now we must live with that knowledge. We must live knowing what we are capable of, what we have done, what we might do again. The interwar period was marked by this knowledge. Europe in the 1920s and 1930s was a continent haunted by its own capacity for violence, traumatized by what it had done to itself, afraid of what it might do next. The veterans walked the streets like ghosts, reminders of the horror, living embodiments of regression. Some tried to warn of what was coming. Sigmund Freud, analyzing the war's psychological impact, wrote in Civilization and Its Discontents, "Men are not gentle creatures who want to be loved. They are creatures among whose instinctual endowments is to be reckoned a powerful share of aggressiveness. The neighbor is for them not only a potential helper or sexual object, but also someone who tempts them to satisfy their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without compensation, to use him sexually without his consent, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture, and to kill him. The war had proven Freud right. It had shown that the aggressive drive was not an aberration, but a fundamental part of human nature, that civilization was a thin and fragile restraint on impulses that ran much deeper. And once those restraints were broken, once men had killed and discovered they could kill, discovered they could enjoy killing, the restraints could not be easily reimposed. Ernst Jünger, still writing, still analyzing, produced what might be his most honest assessment in a 1930 essay. "We who survived are marked men. We carry the trenches inside us. We know what we are capable of. We know that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than a razor's edge. We know that under the right circumstances, under pressure, under fear, under the dissolution of normal social bonds, we can become monsters. This knowledge is liberating and terrifying in equal measure. Liberating because it frees us from illusions. Terrifying because it means we can never fully trust ourselves again." The final irony was that the war had been fought to preserve civilization, to defend Christian Europe from barbarism, to protect the values of the Enlightenment, and it had succeeded in destroying those very things. The trenches had reduced European men to animals, and many of them never fully returned to humanity. They remained suspended between the civilized world and the primal world, belonging fully to neither. By 1939, less than 21 years after the armistice, Europe would be at war again, and this time the horror would be worse. Because this time the men in charge, Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich and thousands of others, were veterans of the First World War. They had been broken by the trenches, they had learned to kill without remorse, they had lost their connection to mercy, to compassion, to the fundamental moral principles that made civilization possible.